All right, we'll do one last short presentation before lunch of a model, and that shouldn't take too long. So Zhao and Lu have a paper from 2011 where they discuss magnitude scaling for large magnitude events and how it might affect the GMPEs. They don't have a specific GMPE to use, but they have a concept of the model. And what's shown here is covering that their idea is above magnitude 7, there is no scaling with magnitude. So they have just shown here, their basics for this are residuals. These are their event terms. So each earthquake, each point here is one event. This is versus magnitude from 7 to 8. The dashed lines in here for reference are Cho and Young's model. And then they did some fits. A couple of regressions are the red line and the dotted lines here. So at shorter period, this is PGV. So in this case, for example, it's nearly flat, their fit. And so they would say there's a suggestion of no magnitude scaling. And in some of these, this is PGA and 5 hertz, there's still a slope. If you go to longer periods, so this is half a second going up to 1 second, you can see by the time they're at these longer periods, there's less magnitude scaling that they see directly from the data compared to a stronger factor that would be in our typical models. And then if you go even longer out to 4 seconds, 3 seconds, it's almost flat. So their suggestion is pretty simple of that. They've said they see no magnitude scaling, and assuming that approach would be a lower bound to capture the uncertainty in what the magnitude scaling is. So this is full saturation, essentially at all distances and all periods, particularly the long period, which is really different than what we found previously. We would have saturation only at short periods. He sees it back in these plots. You can see they would say there's more saturation at these longer periods than at the shorter periods. So that's a different approach. So what we're looking at is considering as a way of implementing this model, in particular with Zhao's 2006 model, is to simply cap the magnitude scaling at 7 so that it would scale up to 7 and then it would be flat beyond that as a way to capture this break in the magnitude scaling, keeping all other aspects of the GMP unchanged. So that would be a lower bound, he would say, that the magnitude scaling shouldn't drop below that, and that would let you set a lower limit on what the GMPE scaling could be at large magnitudes. So John Zhao hasn't said this is what you should do or how to implement his model. He's just said here's what he's thinking. We've sent him, asked him to say, is this capturing what your intent is, and based on that reply, I think he will say, yes, this is one way to do it as a lower bound. So this just means you shouldn't be seeing things dropping below this value. So that'll be one other model that we'll look at. We haven't tried to implement this yet. Questions or comments on that? These guys have already seen that. I don't know, Youssef, is there any?
No, this one bullet before last. So do you want to keep it functional period somehow, at least up to something?
That's not so. If you go here, his model is, so if we're trying to implement his model, is there is no period, there's no magnitude scaling at long periods.
Is it consistent with any database that we have?
This is his data. I mean, these are the big events. There's not a lot of big events to work with, so he's got most of the same ones in there, right? So this is Wenchuan and Chi-Chi and Cocelli and so forth are all in there. We can check this with your own residuals and see what it looks like. But part of this is he just derived these terms and said, let me ignore anything or any assumption about magnitude scaling and see what comes up. Okay, get the microphone.
Has he postulated any transition to this flat thing? Does it happen just abruptly at 7, or?
No, No, and he's done some more work on this to try to say why it should be there, looking at how energy released in big earthquakes, and that it is really not changing these response spectra values at these periods. So, but the paper just said it's just a partial model, right? It's not a complete model. And one question we have is, do we try to create a model out of this, or do we just say, interesting, but move on? One way you could do this is make this model, and in Nico's plots, see where that shows up and say, you know, this might be a bound on where the magnitude scaling drops off and so forth.
Yeah, the other thought that comes to mind is that there probably are alternative explanations for that flattening.
Yes, but he would say, so I'm trying to speak for John here, he would say, but this is what the data show, right? He's really an empirical guy on these types of things, and say, whatever the cause is, if there is no scaling, then that's what the fundamental model is.
Okay.
Paul. Paul's right back there.
Paul Somerville. I think if you asked the SCEC broadband platform what it thinks about this, it would come back and say there is magnitude scaling. I mean, I think that's basically, we wouldn't even have to do the calculations to find out the answer. So here we have a result that flies at long periods, flies completely in the face of everything that we would expect from theory.
Yes, but so I'm going to try to be John's advocate
I
here
understand.
and say
data is something else.
Data is something else, but we just went through a discussion yesterday saying on the long period simulations we are a little skeptical of them, which was right where we want to believe them, right? Tom?
So I think we all recognize we don't have enough data to actually decide this.
Okay.
And when we don't have enough data to decide, we have to use our other common sense in that way. If we only rely on inadequate data, then the nuclear power plants are in trouble.
That's fine. So he's not saying this is the model to use. He is advocating this as a lower bound of what's going on, and that it's going to be something higher than this, but that the lower bound is here as opposed to a much higher value. I think it's worthwhile for us to see if in doing the analysis in the same way we find anything that looks like this. All of us have still some scaling, in particular at larger magnitudes. Most of the other models still have a magnitude term in there. I think at least addressing this and saying why this model is not a candidate model should be dealt with. Kim.
Kim Olsen, Proponent. All the models on the broadband platform do linear wave propagation at the long periods. So that's why we get the scaling, as Paul mentioned. There are some interesting results, including plastic or nonlinear effects, even especially at the long periods. It actually turns out that that seems to somewhat support Zhao's model here, that would result in some kind of saturation or non-scaling effect at the very large magnitude. So I think that's worth keeping in mind. There's still a lot of at the long period, we're talking about 2, 3, 5 seconds, where the surface waves are especially strongly affected at these plastic effects. So, like I said, there's a lot more to look at here, but it certainly would be in line with Zhao's model here, and we'll keep looking at that.
That would be interesting to take what you just ran recently and see what its scaling would look like compared to this, if it's consistent at all. I really, if you know John Zhao, again, he's an empirical guy, and he's going to say, I've looked at the data, here's what it shows. He's looked at some explanations or concepts of why response spectra are not representing the increase. clearly the energy goes up. He's not saying that doesn't change, but he's saying these amplitudes don't. And I think it's worth seeing if there's a set of simulations like what Kim has talked about that are consistent with this, or is this completely rejected, and then we can move on. Are you raising your hand, Christine? Or?
I was asking if you had one.
Currently one, but we will have more.
Okay.
Yes.
Great.
And in particular, we have one large event, and we will look at smaller events to see if that supports this kind
That
of.
would be, because if you could do something around 7 or something instead of such a big one and see what the scaling is, that would be really useful.
Exactly.
Okay. If no other comments, Ralph, you look like you need to say something.
I mean, on the magnitude 7 and bigger, I mean, your corner frequency is going to be very low, much lower than 5 seconds. I mean, it's going to be way out there. Okay?
Right.
So what will happen is that this scaling could just be reflecting a constant stress drop. You're always on the flat part of the spectrum. In the Fourier amplitude spectrum, you'd always be on the flat part determined by the stress parameter. So the corner is really, really low compared to these numbers of periods of 1.2.
But if you're trying to keep the Fourier spectrum flat, you would have to be having the stress drops changing still. I agree you're on the flat part, but the moment is going up.
Moment's going up, yeah.
I think if we could just get a comparison with the simulations that Kim has talked about, to say, is there a physical model that says this is credible or not? Okay, so we don't have to bring along all models, but I think we want to at least address this as essentially an update to what John thinks is a bounding part of this model. Okay, you really don't want to eat, do you?
Oh, just one quick comment. Doesn't add much, but I just wanted to make it. There was, I think, in 1980, a paper by Hanks and Johnston, which hypothesized this, and I don't think anybody stands by that paper anymore. But there we go again.
All right. With that, let's break for lunch. 45 minutes, so back at... no, what time is it now?